The first lesson Albert DeMeo learned wasn't how to ride a bike or throw a ball. It was this: assume the gun is loaded. He was 6 years old, standing in a garage that smelled like oil and cold metal, watching his father empty a bag of pistols onto a workbench like they were groceries. Roy DeMeo handled them with gloves, careful, precise. Not because he was a gentleman, because gentlemen leave no prints. In Brooklyn, Roy wasn't Dad. He was a name that made doors open and voices drop. A Gambino earner. A man who owned a little bar called the Gemini Lounge, where people walked in through a side door and sometimes never walked out again. Upstairs, the towels were ready, the plastic sheets. The routine, down the street, the city kept breathing like nothing happened. And then there was Albert, the kid in the passenger seat on Sunday errands, learning the vocabulary of a world that spoke in code. A balloon wasn't a balloon. A favor wasn't a favor. And family didn't always mean who kissed you goodnight. This is the story of what happens when your hero is also your curse. Because when Roy DeMeo finally gets taken out, the bullet doesn't stop at the father. It keeps traveling, invisible, straight into the sun, into the mirror, into the way the world looks at you when they recognize your face. Albert DeMeo loved his father, but the father belonged to something else. And sooner or later, that something comes to collect for the sins of the father, Albert DeMeo. Albert DeMeo was the son of Roy DeMeo, a ranking member of the Gambino family. Born in 1942 in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, DeMeo Sonner had begun loan sharking as a teenager. By 23, he became owner of the Gemini Lounge, which became the headquarters of his crew. A large number of murders occurred there and bodies were dismembered. By the time Albert was 5, his father was taking him on some of his Sunday errands, and crime was already the family business. One of Roy's crew was his cousin Joseph Dracula Guglielmo. While DeMeo had links to the Lucchese family, he also worked closely with Anthony Nino Gaggi, a soldier with the Gambinos. He became involved in car theft, drug trafficking, money laundering, and hijacking, and used the profits to buy into other businesses. In 1973, Paul Rothenberg, the proprietor of a pornographic film lab DeMeo and Gaggi had a share in, was arrested. Fearing he might talk, DeMeo invited Rothenberg to meet him at a local diner and shot him twice in the head in an alleyway outside. In 1975, members of DeMeo's crew stabbed Andre Katz, the owner of a body shop they had a dispute with, and dismembered his body. Throughout the 1970s, the crew claimed more victims. Usually the target would be lured through the side entrance of the Gemini Lounge, then taken upstairs where DeMeo would be waiting. He carried a gun with a silencer and a towel. He would shoot the victim in the head, wrap the towel around it to staunch the blood, while another crew member stabbed the victim in the heart to stop the blood pumping. The body would be stripped and left in the bathroom until the blood congealed. Plastic sheets were laid out on the floor and the body was cut up. Parts were put in bags, placed in cardboard boxes, and taken to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn. With hundreds of tons of garbage deposited there daily, finding body parts was almost impossible. Even when police tried once, they abandoned it because it proved too costly. DeMeo moved deeper into prostitution and pornography and dealt cocaine and marijuana out of the Gemini Lounge, even though higher-ups in the Gambino family said they did not approve. Even so, Gaggi continued to take his cut. In May 1976, DeMeo was punched in the face by Joseph Brocchini. Because Brocchini was a made man, DeMeo was told he could not retaliate, or if he did, it could not be found out. Soon after, Brocchini's used car dealership was raided, staff were handcuffed, and the office was ransacked, made to look like an armed robbery gone wrong. The following month, DeMeo shot Vincent Govamara, a young man with no connections to organized crime, after Govamara annoyed Gaggi. In July, DeMeo flew to Florida to murder George Byram, another man Gaggi had targeted for revenge. DeMeo reportedly sawed Byram's head half off when disturbed by construction workers nearby. An FBI informant who reported DeMeo was a ruthless killer was later murdered. When Carlo Gambino died and Paul Castellano took over, Gaggi was promoted to capo and DeMeo hoped to become a made man. Castellano looked down on DeMeo as a cheap hoodlum, and DeMeo responded by aligning with an Irish-American gang called the Westies, doing a hit for them. The Westies then became an arm of the Gambino family. Because DeMeo set up the alliance, he was formally inducted into the Gambino family, but warned not to murder anyone without permission and to avoid drug trafficking. Even so, DeMeo continued selling drugs and committing unsanctioned killings openly. He killed car thief Jonathan Quinn, a suspected informer, and Quinn's 19-year-old girlfriend, Sherry Golden. When confronted by his superiors, DeMeo said it was too risky to leave her alive. By 1978, DeMeo was bragging he had killed 100 people and solicited contracts from the 5 families. sometimes for as little as $5,000 or even for free as a professional favor. He killed and dismembered one of his own crew, Edward "Danny" Grillo, after Grillo fell into debt and Gaggy feared he might be susceptible to police coercion. DeMeo also killed his second-in-command Chris Rosenberg after Rosenberg murdered a Cuban drug dealer connected to the Colombian drug cartel. The Colombians threatened war on the Gambinos unless Rosenberg was killed. Before Rosenberg was taken out, DeMeo shot Dominic Rigucci, a student selling door-to-door to pay for college. When Rigucci parked outside DeMeo's house in Massapequa, Long Island, DeMeo assumed he was a Colombian assassin. After a car chase left Rigucci's car too damaged to continue, DeMeo killed him. Gaggy then ordered DeMeo to kill Rosenberg before any more innocent victims were killed. Rosenberg claimed he knew nothing about the Colombian situation, but was killed anyway. His body was left in his car at the side of a road in Brooklyn so it would be found. The Colombians demanded proof, so Rosenberg could not be dismembered and made to vanish at Fountain Avenue dump. According to Albert and two crew members who later became state's evidence, DeMeo was genuinely upset by Rosenberg's death and showed remorse for the first time, but it did not stop him from killing. The FBI had amassed a massive file of people linked to DeMeo or the Gemini Lounge who had disappeared. A bug in the home of Gambino soldier Angelo Ruggiero picked up talk that there was trouble finding someone to take the contract because DeMeo was surrounded by an army of killers. Gambino soldier Frank DeChico eventually took the contract but could not get near DeMeo. The job was eventually passed on to DeMeo's own men. On 10 January 1983, DeMeo went to crew member Patrick Testa's body shop for a meeting. On 18 January, his body was found in the trunk of his abandoned car with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. It was thought Gaggy might have pulled the trigger. Crew members Joseph Testa and Anthony Center were there too. However, Iceman, Richard Kuklinski, claimed he killed DeMeo, having carried out contracts for him earlier. He even claimed to have pistol-whipped the corpse. Gaggy was never charged with DeMeo's murder. He later died of a heart attack while standing trial for other murders. Testa and Center were given life sentences for 25 murders, plus car theft, drug trafficking, and extortion. This was based on evidence from crew members Frederick Denome and Dominic Montiglio. Paul Castellano was indicted for DeMeo's murder, and it was believed he ordered it because DeMeo was set to be jailed for his stolen car operation. But Castellano was out on bail when John Gotti had him gunned down. It was thought at least 70 people were murdered by DeMeo and his Gemini Lounge crew, though estimates ran as high as 200. For Albert DeMeo, who idolized his father, this became a legacy to live down. He later described it in his memoir, For the Sins of My Father, a Mafia Killer, His Son, and the Legacy of a Mob Life. If you appreciate deep, unfiltered investigations into the real underworld, not the Hollywood version, consider subscribing to Behind the Veil Truths. It helps us keep opening files like this. Albert's point of view: I started learning about guns when I was 6, Albert recalls. His father bought and sold guns regularly and collected antiques, especially pistols from the Civil War and before. Sometimes Roy would bring home a bag of guns and empty them onto the workbench to clean in the garage. Albert became fascinated by the mechanics and by 8 could disassemble and reassemble virtually any gun. Roy insisted on strict rules. Assume a gun is loaded, point it down and away, never point it at someone unless prepared to use it. Roy wore gloves when handling weapons and told Albert Isotoner gloves were best because they let you work efficiently without leaving fingerprints. Roy also explained coldly and practically that if it became necessary to shoot someone, the safest thing was to aim for the head and fire at least 2 bullets. Albert says he understood the gravity of what he was being taught, and that it never occurred to him to aim a gun at a human being. He never handled a gun without his father's permission. Roy began cracking the window to show Albert the world outside Massapequa. As other fathers took sons to fire stations or offices, Roy took Albert into Manhattan social clubs, especially in Little Italy. When Albert entered 3rd grade, weekends mattered because Roy was gone so much. Albert remembers the first social club. Loud, crowded, card games, horse racing on TV, men cheering and cursing. Everyone seemed to know Roy. Men approached asking about balloons. One asked to borrow 50 balloons, and Roy said sure, and they took a walk. Albert imagined actual balloons. They went to a cafe, ordered espresso and pastries, and Roy quietly passed envelopes under the table. Outside, Albert asked for one of the balloons. Roy laughed and explained a balloon meant $1,000. The man wanted to borrow money. By 4th grade, Albert finally put a name to what his father did. After seeing the funeral mass of Carlo Gambino on TV, he saw Uncle Nino and then his father walking out of the church. His body went numb. The newspaper names, the social club faces, the crime stories all snapped into focus. His father was a mobster. From then on, Albert says he lived in constant terror of losing his father. He never slept through the night again. After Roy's death, Albert describes feeling in training for his father's death since he was 12, but still unprepared for the abyss of pain that opened when it happened. Roy's final advice was to forget him and have a good life, but Albert didn't know how. Instead, he carried on with the non-mob business of his father's life, taking care of family, being present for his mother and sisters, trying to fill the space Roy left. He also felt responsible for people who depended on Roy. Cousin Joe, he believed, could not survive alone. Albert decided to send Joe away with cash to start over. At the airport, Joe gave Albert a battered journal of recipes and anecdotes as the only legacy he could offer. Albert worried about Freddie DeMeo, who was devastated. Things worsened when Freddie's brother Richie disappeared and was later found with bullets through the back of his head. Albert suspected the mob got nervous because Richie knew too much, and the FBI was pressuring him to turn informant. When Albert visited Freddie in jail, Freddie acted strangely and repeatedly asked who Albert thought murdered Roy, as if coached. Albert believed Freddie had been turned. That shift made Albert feel he couldn't trust anyone. Soon, Roy's old crew approached Albert. They said they needed to tie up loose ends and wanted Roy's Shylock book, the Loan Shark Ledger, plus tagging tools used for car theft. Albert believed they were lying and only trying to line their own pockets. Roy's crew owed him hundreds of thousands, and Albert knew they had no intention of paying the family. Albert agreed to meet at a family-style diner in Massapequa, thinking it would be safe. In the parking lot, the Gemini twins and others were waiting. They motioned him into a car. Albert got in without thinking, assuming they feared eavesdroppers. Only once they were driving did Albert realize the trap. Joey and Anthony pulled back their coats to show guns in their belts. Albert thought, "This is a hit," and I walked right into it. They questioned him about tagging tools and the ledger. He denied knowing about any book. He knew they didn't believe him. He was stalling, trying to buy time. They eventually brought him back to the diner. As they let him out, one offered condolences, telling him to call if he needed anything. Albert felt a chill and believed he'd been speaking to his father's murderers. He walked back to his car, confident, fearless, arrogant, and only allowed himself to feel relief once he was away. A cat-and-mouse game followed. They wanted Roy's remaining money-making tools, while Albert wanted to know who had been involved in Roy's murder and how. Albert sometimes met them inside the diner, but often stayed in the parking lot, speaking within sight of suburban families pushing strollers, unaware of the negotiations happening in plain view. Next time, Albert brought extra insurance. He told his friend Nick, who arrived early and watched from a distance with a loaded rifle trained on them, just in case. Albert admits he was in over his head and didn't realize it yet, because what you're about to hear changes everything. And if you want more cases where loyalty collapses and power turns lethal, stay with Behind the Veil Truths. Albert says the FBI also targeted him, assuming he would cooperate because Roy's associates were implicated in Roy's murder. Albert refused. He says he didn't have as much information as they believed, and feared that if he became involved, the Mafia would kill him long before any trial, and Roy's killers would go free. Federal agents followed him, questioned him repeatedly, tried veiled threats and then sympathy. Albert saw through it and hired a lawyer on Roy's payroll. Until he turned 18, he says there was little else they could do, but the pressure intensified his rage and obsession. As winter dragged on, Albert felt the need for vengeance growing. He built a hidden compartment in his car for a gun, supercharged the engine for escape, and assessed his one-man army, realizing it lacked firepower. He'd heard Roy had hidden arsenals. In desperation, he called Nino Gaggi, asking where Roy's weapon supply was. 2 days later, after a date with his girlfriend, Albert describes driving home feeling calm, almost peaceful, believing he'd soon act. Then, without warning, 4 cars surrounded him and forced him off the road. His Corvette crashed into trees. Albert grabbed his gun and fired blindly, but was quickly overpowered. He says the attackers were the Gemini twins wearing dark clothes and ski masks. A voice told him they weren't going to kill him this time, out of respect for his father. But if he made more threats, they would. Albert was pistol-whipped in the eye socket and lost consciousness. Hours later, Nick found him by chance, bleeding and cold, and got him to the hospital. Surgery took over 8 hours. His cheekbone, eye socket, and much of the left side of his face were shattered. Doctors rebuilt his face with a wire cage for the eye socket. His eye was spared permanent damage, but more operations would be needed. Federal agents showed up quickly, hovering during surgery and questioning him during recovery. Albert told no one what really happened. Officially, it was a car accident. He says the pain and immobility became a truth serum, and in that forced stillness he realized revenge was useless. Roy's friends had murdered him and nearly killed Albert, while Nick, with nothing to gain, saved his life, trying to live, being pulled back. After leaving the hospital, Albert tried to bury the past. He stopped contacting the crew and stopped visiting Freddie. He tried to be 17 again, swimming, boating, dating, preparing for college, wanting to stop being the mobster's son, but surveillance didn't fade. It shifted from Roy to Albert. He says he was followed everywhere and repeatedly pulled over, searched, humiliated in public. Tickets piled up, his license was suspended, and his anger grew. Eventually, he was arrested on alleged outstanding traffic warrants for tickets he says he'd never seen, tied to cars he didn't recognize. During the ride to booking, officers taunted him about his father. In a burst of rage, Albert fought back, was pepper-sprayed, and shackled in a filthy, crowded cell. He describes it as a nightmare and felt like a specimen being displayed. After more than 12 hours, officers rediscovered his paperwork. In court, he was shown citations he didn't recognize. He was finally released to his lawyer, but disturbed by the sense that someone was manufacturing charges. At home, he spiraled. Fear, guilt, ulcers, sleeplessness. He mentally listed every crime he might have committed just by being Roy's son and helping with errands. He didn't know where the line was between loyalty and criminality. What haunted him most, he says, was not what he'd done, but why they hated him so much. Then, staring at his reflection, he realized the answer. It wasn't him they hated. It was Roy. And every time they looked at Albert, they saw Roy's face. In their eyes, he wasn't just the mobster's son. He was the mobster. The mob calls it betrayal. The courtroom calls it testimony. What do you call it? If you want more stories where truth and loyalty collide, subscribe to Behind the Veil Truths and join the investigation.